In this chapter, we're going to be covering personality disorders, which, as you will see, is an entirely different class of disorders compared to everything else covered in this textbook. We are going to start the chapter by discussing personality and personality assessment. And then we will discuss each of the personality disorders in turn. Because there are so many personality disorders, currently 10 recognized by the DSM-5, we will divide them as the DSM does into clusters, A, B, and C, and we'll cover each of the disorders in turn. The concept of personality has been around for a long time. Basically, it refers to consistency of behavior, but not absolute consistency of behavior, because we behave differently at a party than we do in a class or at a funeral, but rather a relative consistency. Some people are warmer. Some people are generous. Some people are hostile. Not in all situations, but they tend to be relatively consistent. The traditional way of thinking of personality is a trait that we have, a consistency of characteristics, but the behavioral model views that consistency as something we've learned over time, perhaps influenced by genetics, but represents a behavioral pattern that works for us. Some of the early models of personality are rather laughable at this point. For example, at one point, once we realized that many of the functions, behaviors, are controlled by specific locations in the brain, we started thinking of personality traits that way. And so if there was a part of the brain that was responsible for aggressiveness, that part of the brain would be bigger, just like a muscle gets bigger when it's used a lot. And as it got bigger, it would push our skull out, creating little bumps. That process is called phrenology. No one takes it seriously anymore, but there was a time in which it was taken quite seriously. There's also a concept of personality within a psychodynamic framework. Except within psychodynamic framework, there's the belief that much of our personality is outside of our awareness. It's in our unconscious. So projective techniques, which we've talked about earlier, were used to assess personality in the unconscious. What has probably dominated the field of personality is the trait approaches. Traits are consistency in behavior, and there are many different traits that have been studied. The traits have been studied typically with self-report measures. Sophisticated statistical analyses have been done with the data, and we have developed an understanding of the basic structure of personality that, although not considered to be the be-all and end-all of personality, is currently considered the state-of-the-art. Although there are a lot of words in the English language to represent traits, just over 26,000 words in an unabridged dictionary, we don't really believe there are 26,000 different traits. Instead, we believe that traits are probably combinations of underlying major traits. And we've had models of that going back well before we had sophisticated measures of psychological traits and the statistical analyses of those measures. Eysenck and Eysenck, for example, proposed a three-factor model of major traits that influence almost all behavior. Neuroticism, again, that was one of Freud's concepts, was a general anxiety level. And extroversion, we think of extroversion as primarily being outgoing, but they defined it more in terms of energy level, and being outgoing was simply part of that. and something called psychoticism, which is a tendency to have perceptual distortions or distortions of thought. Except for severe disorders, neuroticism and extroversion were the most important traits. The current state of the art with respect to personality assessment is what we call the Big Five. These are 5 relatively independent traits that seem to account for virtually all of the trait words that exist. So any trait that you can think of represents some combination of these traits, sometimes low levels for 2 or 3 traits and high levels for others, sometimes mid-level for some traits, high level for others, but always some sort of combination. The 5 big 5 personality traits are openness to experience. That's a willingness to try new things. Being willing to explore. Conscientiousness, which is exactly what you would think it is. Being careful about meeting requirements that people expect of us. Extroversion, which is, again, not what you think it is. It's more of an external energy. Extroverts need to be doing things. They find themselves unable to just sit back and think by themselves. Agreeableness, which is a tendency to just get along with people. And neuroticism, which is an anxiety level. Now, after reviewing personality, it's important for me to tell you that until quite recently, the research on personality and the research on personality disorders had almost nothing to do with one another. In the DSM-5, there had been some overlaps that we had not seen before. But by and large, the history of the personality disorders and the history of the study of personality have little overlap. The personality disorders include 10 different personality disorders in 3 clusters. The clusters only represent similarities of behavior, and there is no particular closeness within the clusters itself to the various disorders. There is a new section we'll talk about at the end called Section 3, which starts to integrate the idea of personality and personality disorders. Before we jump into the personality disorders, I want to cover a couple of issues. First of all, personality disorders were introduced with DSM-3, and they were put on a separate axis from all of the other disorders. Axis 2. Now, Axis 2, in fact, all of the axes no longer exist in the DSM-5. But the reason that personality disorders, and by the way, in the same category, intellectual dysfunction was on Axis 2, the reason Axis 2 existed is these were characteristics of the individual that were stable and tended to affect psychological functioning, but by and large were egosyntonic. Remember, egosyntonic means it doesn't feel like symptoms to the people, and so there's no desire to change it. But the behaviors associated with the personality disorders often created difficult situations that might be depressing for the individual or create anxiety, etc. A second issue, very important, is that there's an enormous amount of overlap among the 10 personality disorders. If you qualify for a personality disorder diagnosis, on average, you will qualify for 3 personality disorders. Now, sometimes there are people that only qualify for 1. Sometimes there are people that qualify for 5 or 6 personality disorders to get that average of 3. That's called comorbidity, and it's an issue that concerns diagnosticians a lot, why there should be so much overlap with the personality disorders. We certainly have comorbid Axis 1 disorders. It's very common, for example, to have people who are anxious also be depressed, but not at the level that we see with personality disorders. And then finally, some of the personality disorders, because we have a sense of what personality is, are often misdiagnosed because people are not following the criteria. So we would have very low inner rater reliability. Now that's a bias. We can't tolerate biases in diagnosis because it gives us inaccurate information, inaccurate diagnostic categories. I mentioned earlier that we take the 10 personality disorders and group them into 3 clusters, which we call A, B, and C. Of course, A, B, and C doesn't give us any idea what the clusters are, so there are names associated with the clusters. So cluster A is called the odd or eccentric cluster, and the symptoms found there have a certain oddity. Cluster B is the dramatic or erratic cluster, and cluster C is the avoidant or fearful cluster. Now, these clusters are just to help us organize a large number of disorders. They don't seem to have any particular reality. The comorbidity problem that we talked about in the previous slide will sometimes occur within a cluster, but often occur across clusters. So we have a lot of disorders in cluster A that are comorbid with, say, cluster B disorders. We will use this organization simply because that's the way the DSM handles it, and we will go through the disorders in order. Now, I mentioned that personality disorders started out on axis 2 because they were largely egocentric, which meant people don't come into therapy to have their personality changed. To them, it's just who they are. So some people, for example, tend to be anxious. And they're not always comfortable with that, but that's who they are. Some people tend to be moody, and they just accept that they're moody. So they have no desire to change. It's very hard to change any kind of personality anyway. When there's no desire for the patient to change, it's just not going to happen. So in general, we rarely treat personality disorders. And quite frankly, clients with personality disorders rarely want to be treated. So except for a couple of instances, I won't be talking about the treatment of these disorders. 1, there's not a lot of research on it, and 2, in general, there's not a lot of demand for it. So let's start with cluster A personality disorders. We have 3 disorders within that: paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. I'll be talking about each of them in turn, so I'm not going to define them just yet. Without you even looking at the slide, my guess is you can pretty well guess what someone with paranoid personality disorder would be like. What I'm going to do with this disorder and all of the other disorders is follow a template to give you an idea of the characteristics that define the disorder and a little bit about how those characteristics affect the way the person behaves. We'll call that dynamics. And then I'll tell you a little bit more about the disorder, things like base rates, and when possible, what we know about the underlying factors for the disorders. So for paranoid personality disorder, we don't have the psychotic paranoid delusions that we find in some disorders, but rather a pervasive distrust of other people. Now, because people are so distrustful of others, there usually is a certain level of isolation because they don't really want to share much with others. Now, the dynamics, this distrust, leads to people constantly brooding about whether someone can be trusted. And they're very unlikely to confide in others. And on those rare occasions when they do, since their ideas are often a little strange, The people they confide in say, oh, that's weird. Now that's much too, I think you're overreacting to it. And of course, that increases their level of distrust. They feel like they are being rebuffed for being crazy, and they become increasingly more isolated. They are very sensitive to these kinds of reactions and tend to, if anything, overreact to them. Well, what do we know about paranoid personality disorder? Appears to be more common in males, in clinical populations at least, and we know it's been around for a very long time. We have vivid descriptions of people with paranoid personality disorder, often people in leadership positions, especially if they tend to be tyrants. Frankly, if you're a leader and a tyrant, there are going to be a lot of people that want to get you, and so perhaps being paranoid is not entirely unreasonable. They tend to overlap with schizotypal personality disorder, which we'll talk about shortly, and also with borderline and avoidant personality, and some overlap with antisocial, histrionic, and dependent personality. Now, don't worry about all those details. The take-home message is very simple. Virtually every disorder I'm going to talk about overlaps with other disorders, and sometimes the overlap is very strong. That's the comorbidity problem that I talked about earlier. There may be some risk for schizophrenia and for delusional disorder, which we'll talk about in the chapter on schizophrenia. The risk for schizophrenia, though, tends not to be terribly high unless the person with paranoid personality disorder also qualifies for schizotypal personality disorder. The next disorder within cluster A is schizoid personality disorder. The schiz part of schizoid would suggest that this is somehow related to schizophrenia. And there may be some overlap with schizophrenia, although not nearly as much as with schizotypal personality disorder. In schizoid personality disorder, the defining characteristic is a detachment from other people and relationships with other people. The detachment is driven by a lack of interest, not by anxiety. So they tend not to want to have social relationships. Now, Bloiler, who coined the term schizoid and also coined the term schizophrenia, argued that schizoid personality was a defense mechanism of turning inward because focusing outward was too stressful for the individual. He suggested, although he had no evidence for it, that this might be a mechanism that protected people at risk for schizophrenia from ever developing schizophrenia. The key element here is it's an indifference to social relationship, not a fear of social relationships, that drive this behavior. Also, what's particularly interesting is these individuals generally have no interest in sexual contact, but very high interest in sex. And so they engage in massive amounts of masturbation because they can do that in a solitary way without having the distress of establishing and maintaining a social relationship. People with schizoid personality disorder tend to show mild forms of what we call the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. We're going to talk about this later, so I'm going to be very brief here. Negative symptoms are absence of characteristics that should be there in a healthy individual. So, for example, we generally enjoy things, a good meal, a hot shower, warm sunshine, especially in the spring after a cold winter. If you don't enjoy things, that's called anhedonia, and that is a negative symptom of schizophrenia. There are several negative symptoms. We'll talk more about them when we get to schizophrenia. The base rate for this disorder is relatively low, probably around 1%, somewhere between 0.5% and 2% in the general population. But we also know that it's overrepresented in clinical populations. Now, by clinical populations, I mean outpatient clinics where the individual has come in for treatment. Now, let me emphasize, almost no one comes in for treatment for a personality disorder. People come in for treatment because they're depressed, or they're anxious, or they're having difficulty functioning in certain situations. So people with this personality disorder, and in fact, most of the personality disorders, are overrepresented in clinical populations, perhaps because the personality traits are leading them to develop some symptoms that are distressing to them. Heavy overlap here with schizotypal and avoidant personality disorder, but for very different reasons. We'll talk more about that when we get to schizotypal and avoidant personality. It's not clear whether these people are at risk. Some people, including Bloiler, who coined the term, believe that they might have risk factors, but that the schizoid features tend to protect them from the actual risks that they might experience. They tend to want to be isolated, and they will be isolated not only in their social life, but often will choose occupations that allow them to work by themselves. The third disorder in cluster A is called schizotypal personality disorder. It is characterized by an oddness in thought, perception, and social interactions, as well as some magical thinking and suspiciousness. Most people would describe someone with schizotypal personality disorder as odd or unusual. They're not crazy. Their symptoms are more kind of unusual ways of looking at things. But the majority of individuals are uncomfortable around people with schizotypal personality disorder. Now, I'm going to come back to this in just a minute. Because these individuals are a little odd, people respond to them and often shy away from them. Perhaps for this reason, perhaps for other reasons, they tend to have what is called ideas of reference. Those are paranoid-like feelings, but not quite paranoia. For example, if you're watching someone give the news, you have ideas of reference if you believe that they're talking specifically to you, rather than giving the news to tens of thousands or millions of people all at once. Ideas of reference may also include the idea that some things are signs that only you can read. Now, these individuals often desire social relationships. Now, that makes them very different from schizoid individuals who have no desire for social relationships, but they have trouble maintaining social relationships. Now, I'm going to get on a soapbox here just briefly. These people often make great friends. Now, they are a little unusual, and sometimes they're more than a little unusual, but they're usually not psychotic, and their risk for psychosis is relatively low. I have had many friends over the years with schizotypal personality disorder, and they've been wonderful friends. Now, perhaps I'm more comfortable with the oddness that they occasionally show. But I will tell you, because they desire social relationships, when you reciprocate, they will be as loyal as you can imagine and will be wonderful friends. So I encourage you, if you're one of the people who's comfortable sometimes with a little oddness, don't write these people off simply because you don't understand where they're coming from. Schizotypal personality disorder is unique among the personality disorders because it is the only personality disorder that is defined by its relationship to an axis 1 disorder, schizophrenia. For example, if you look at identical twins, one who has schizophrenia and the other does not, you may remember that's called discordant twins. The identical twin who does not have schizophrenia almost always qualifies for schizotypal personality disorder. In other words, they have the oddness, and there's clear evidence that that oddness, which only occasionally results in the development of schizophrenia, is part of the genetic risk factors for schizophrenia. Now, I need to point out that it isn't just schizophrenia that people with schizotypal personality disorders are at risk for. They also seem to be at risk for mania and depression, mood disorders that often reach psychotic levels. In the general population, we're probably talking about 3%, although it depends on how you measure it. Some of the research that I did on measuring schizotypal features, specific signs for schizotypal personality disorders, suggests that base rate may be a little higher, about 5%. But it's in a range so that, maybe 1 in 20 or 1 in 30 of the population qualifies. I want to talk about a historical fact here that I think is very interesting. It'll help us to understand an issue. For many years, we recognized that there seemed to be people who had some of the features of schizophrenia, but usually didn't develop schizophrenia. We had lots and lots of names for them. Sometimes we called them borderline schizophrenia because, well, they were kind of on the border. Often we would say it was on the border of neuroses and psychoses. Sometimes we would call it pseudoneurotic schizophrenia because it looked, in terms of the symptoms, like it was primarily an anxiety-based disorder, but it was actually an underlying psychotic process that never fully developed. Two people studied this group extensively, and both were brilliant and very persuasive. Paul Meehl studied this group and was struck by the fact that the risk for schizophrenia seemed to be several-fold higher than people selected at random, maybe as high as 5%. Now, the base rate for schizophrenia is 1%, so that's a 5-fold increase in risk. So he focused on the idea that this group that we called pseudoneurotic schizophrenia, or one of the dozen other labels used at the time, were genetically related to schizophrenia. Otto Kernberg looked at the same group and said, these people have a lot of symptoms, and they do sometimes look like the symptoms are variations of schizophrenia, but it is rare that they ever develop schizophrenia. And so he focused on the borderline feature. And right now in the DSM, we have two disorders that were drawn from this original group of pseudoneurotic schizophrenics, one called schizotypal personality disorder, that was influenced by Paul Meehl, and one called borderline personality disorder, which is in cluster B and was influenced by Kernberg. Even though we've tried very hard to make the criteria for each of these diagnoses very different from one another, they have an enormous overlap. It appears that this group, borderline schizophrenia or borderline pseudoneurotic schizophrenia, really is one group, and so the overlap shouldn't be surprising. What is interesting, though, is when we set up the criteria, we thought that we could separate two groups and identify those who were at risk separate from those who were not at risk for schizophrenia, and we haven't done a very good job of that. We're going to move on to cluster B now. This is the dramatic or erratic cluster. And there are 4 categories of personality disorders, and we'll talk about each of them in turn. Antisocial personality disorder is characterized by a pervasive disregard for others. These people lie, they cheat, they steal. They don't really care about other people. We use terms like psychopath and sociopath to refer to these individuals, and that is nearly synonymous with antisocial personality disorder, but it's not quite synonymous. This is a particularly interesting disorder because the researchers, and there are about a dozen major researchers in the entire world who focus almost exclusively on antisocial personality disorder, they flat out refuse to use the DSM to define their group. They basically say that the DSM missed the mark. Let me explain the ideals, or the idea behind this. The DSM, starting with DSM-3, focused on observable behaviors so that we could get better inter-rater reliability. But with antisocial personality disorder, the observable behaviors were things like getting in trouble with the law, being delinquent, and some people who get in trouble with the law or are delinquent have antisocial personality disorder. But there are also people who get in trouble with the law without antisocial personality disorder. So the researchers argued that, in effect, this is like looking for your keys under the street light when you drop them in a dark alley. And you're looking under the street light because they're easier to find with the better light. But they're not there. They're in the dark alley. What you need is a flashlight and go into the alley. Okay, what are the dynamics of antisocial personality disorder? These individuals seem to have very few real emotions, but they're usually very good actors or actresses. They can fake the emotion. They are sometimes incredibly charming, and they can fool people very easily when they interact. But they tend to be impulsive, manipulative. They're also easily bored, and will often do things simply because they are bored. They don't love people, but they also don't feel guilt or shame. So when they do things that we would not do simply because the guilt would eat us alive, it has no impact on them. In case you don't recognize the person in the picture, that's Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was put to death for killing 3 nurses in Florida. The picture you see there is him sitting at the defense table, serving as his own attorney. Now, does he look anxious? No, he looks like the most relaxed individual you could ever imagine. No one would guess that he was on trial for his life. Researchers who study people like Ted Bundy and call them psychopaths or sociopaths, which, by the way, although some textbooks will say there's a distinction between the theoretical model for it, there is no real distinction in those terms. They're essentially synonyms. They argue that we want to define these people not by their history and the things that they've done, but by their characteristics. And in fact, they've got a set of characteristics that I'm going to illustrate shortly. This is the first half of the Psychopathy Checklist. These individuals tend to be pathological liars, but charming. They don't experience guilt. They don't experience real emotion, or if they do, it tends to be rather shallow. But they're very good at faking that. They tend to be sexually active, but they don't typically fall in love. So often the sex is just for the pleasure and not part of what we would call making love. To them, sex is sex and has nothing to do with love. This is also part of the Psychopathy Checklist. These individuals, partly because of the features that we just talked about, tend to get into a lot of behavioral problems because, well, they don't worry about getting caught. They don't experience guilt, which tends to make it less likely that we will engage in negative behaviors. They're often irresponsible because they don't care if people think that they're responsible. And they often, partly because they're very charming, get into short-term relationships, but it's very rare that they will stay married for any length of time. When they get married, it's not so much that they're in love, it's that, okay, this is just a way of securing, for a while, a short while, a lot of sexual interaction. They're often juvenile delinquents, but there are a lot of juvenile delinquents who will never grow up to be psychopaths. We'll talk about that later on in the course. By the way, let me stop for a moment and emphasize something here. It may have felt to you when I talked about the Psychopathy Checklist like I was mispronouncing the word, because you probably thought I meant psychopathology. Those are two very different words. Psychopathology is a generic term that refers to everything that we'll cover in this course. Psychopathy is the narrow term to describe the psychopath. So they're different concepts. You probably are not familiar with the term psychopathy, but have heard psychopathology many times. Now, when I discuss the features here, we've actually got a lot of information about these individuals. And so I'll be able to give you much more that probably will give you insights into what makes a psychopath. First of all of our behavior tends to be influenced by some balancing components that we call the behavioral inhibition and the behavioral activation systems. Behavioral activation pushes us to reach out to achieve rewards. The behavioral inhibition system holds us back to avoid punishment. And we need to be able to do both. The behavioral activation system in psychopaths appears to be entirely normal. In contrast, the behavioral inhibition system appears to be underactivated in psychopaths. That's why psychopaths don't feel guilt. That's why they don't worry about getting caught, because the behavioral inhibition system is not functioning. As I mentioned earlier in another chapter, 3% of males, but about 1% of females, a 3-to-1 ratio, qualify for the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy using either definition. But it's genetically related to somatization disorder, which was 3 times more common in women than men. That gives us some very interesting clues, because it appears that the genes that set people up for antisocial personality disorder are shared with another disorder, but the way it plays out may depend on gender and probably some other factors as well. Now, individuals who are psychopaths are overrepresented in prison because they engage in a lot of illegal activity. They're more overrepresented early in their life because their impulsivity leads to them often getting caught for the illegal activity. But only about half of prisoners qualify for the diagnosis of psychopathy or antisocial personality disorders. Substance abuse is very common, largely because they are self-medicating and because they tend to be impulsive. There's a strong genetic component here, but it interacts with environment. Many psychopaths, when they have children, do not raise their children. They're not responsible enough to take on that role. But when they do raise their children, the likelihood of psychopathic behavior increases dramatically, because you have a combination not only of the genes that were passed on, but the environmental influence as well. This slide shows the ratio of psychopaths to non-psychopaths at various age groups within a prison population. What you'll notice is young psychopaths get into trouble a lot, largely because of their impulsiveness and lack of planning, and as a result they get caught and they go to jail. So most of the young prisoners tend to qualify as psychopaths. But as they age, they tend to be a little less impulsive and therefore are less represented among prison populations.